Welcome to Teso Consulting Group's DEI podcast series, Why Is It So Hard? Shining Through the Shadow of Resistance. I'm Dr. Tonya Breland.
And I am Erika Lee.
Welcome back.
Welcome back, everyone.
We are here. I am Tonya.
And I'm Erika. And it's really good to see all of you again.
Yes.
Thank you for joining another episode of our podcast, Why Is It So Hard? Shining Through the Shadows of Resistance.
Mm-hmm. So today's topic is, will the real allies please stand up?
Please. So we really like this topic. We like all our topics, but this episode we're really excited about. As you know, in our podcast series, we really try to discuss issues that prevent us from being socially just and free. And so we feel like this topic really sort of leads us to our goal of disrupting the status quo and just being the change that we want to see. And so we're going to talk about allyship today.
Yeah, so we're really excited about this topic because this is something that everybody can benefit from. So when we think about allyship, before we get into what we mean when we talk about allyship, because we have our own like allyship continuum, because that's what we do. We come up with things. But before we talk about that, I think we have to kind of touch on privilege again. We have talked about privilege. A lot of times when people think about privilege, they are almost always talking about or thinking about like racial privilege. Yeah. And while that is significant and still very important, we also want to point out that we have privilege that may not have anything to do with our race or ethnicity.
Sure.
So you want to kind of run down some of those?
Yeah. So in a previous podcast episode, I talked about height, right? Yeah. So I am 5'4". So that's, I don't have the height that you have, so I'm considered actually short. So when I go to a grocery store, there are times when I can't reach things. So I have to, hope that somebody, yes, I will give my husband a break. But things that are on higher shelves or whatever, like I can't, so I can't reach. So very often those kinds of things aren't necessarily built for me. So I also think about when I go shopping for slacks or, even sort of a long skirt, right? So if there's not a petite section, I know I'm going to have to buy the slacks or the pants or the jeans and then have them tailored because there's just no way, they'll be too long. And so when we think about privilege, it's almost, I like to think about like those things that you don't have to think about. Right. So if you're taller than 5'5" or whatever, you really don't have to think about whether or not you can reach something or hope that somebody's going to be in the grocery store for you. You don't really have to think about it. Like you have open access to that particular resource.
Absolutely.
And that really is, when I think about privilege, we see privilege in, so that's just an example in terms of the height, but we see privilege around race. We see privilege around ability. We see privilege around language. So we see all of those things where, sometimes people have to think about the access that they will have because they don't enjoy privilege in a certain area.
Right. And I think that's really important to consider because, you could probably see yourself in, any one of those areas that we talked about when it comes to privilege.
Yeah.
And what's really important is because you don't have to think about those issues, if you will, we want to challenge you to begin to think about them. We want you to think about where you have an advantage, where someone else doesn't have an advantage. And that's really what we mean by allyship. I mean, that's just a piece of it because we kind of really talk through this a little bit more, and we kind of break down allyship just along the lines of a continuum. Looking at what the research says about allyship and really just kind of coming up with our own spin on it that I think you'll find yourself somewhere on this continuum, because really allyship is more like a journey.
Yeah, it is. It is, rather than sort of like this fixed point, and this fixed point for all things, right? So what we have found, and what you will probably find in the course of this conversation, is that maybe you're further along in some areas and not so much in other areas. And some of that has to do with the privilege that you have in that particular area or category. So let's break down like the continuum. So where do we start?
So we start with the non-ally. So the non-ally is just that.
Yeah.
That's the person who essentially is oblivious to the advantages that they might have. They're oblivious to injustices that might occur as a result of people being marginalized because they don't have certain privilege. And so that non-ally is, people don't want to see themselves as a non-ally because they may see that as like a negative.
Right.
But really they're still sleeping on what's going on around them.
And sometimes it's passive in terms of just being oblivious, but sometimes it's actively disagreeing that an injustice is happening in a particular area, right? So they're not an ally because they flat out don't want to be. They deny. We talked about DEI deniers in an earlier podcast, but they really deny the fact that injustice exists for a particular group of people.
Right. Yeah. And so, those non-ally folks don't have to stay as non-allies. Essentially, they can move up or move along the continuum, and they can become, bystanders.
Yeah.
And we hear stories about bystanders all the time. We also hear where, and I think you would know what a bystander is, but just so that we are on the same page. A bystander is really somebody that notices that something may be going on, but they don't want to get involved.
Yeah.
So they kind of distance themselves, although they see it. So recently, unfortunately, on the New York subway, there was a homeless man.
Yeah.
Did you see that?
I sure did.
There was a homeless man who was killed on the subway in front of a group of bystanders. So this was, a man who was socioeconomically disadvantaged, also had some mental health challenges, and, posed as a threat apparently to some. And he, someone on the train decided that they were going to step up. We don't know the full story. Right. It's still, still being investigated. And, probably by the time this podcast airs,
maybe there'll be some more.
We'll have more information about it because it absolutely made national news. But unfortunately, the gentleman that stepped in to, I guess, to arrest, if you will, the homeless gentleman, put him in a headlock that essentially killed him.
Yes. Yeah.
And it was all caught on camera.
Yeah. Yep. A chokehold for 15 minutes.
Right.
Yeah.
So what we're talking about, that's a bystander.
Yeah.
So the fact that someone has a camera and is able to film everything that's going on.
Yes.
And they don't step in to save this man who's being killed.
That's right.
Right before their very eyes.
That's right. So this person notices.
When did we get to that place as a society?
I have to say that I think it's social media. I hate to blame it, not social media, maybe even the phones. So it's like my act of resistance here is the camera. Like I'm recording this. So I think about like the George Floyd situation. Sure. This is my act of resistance. So, I think even in that, I'm not sure, but I think in that space they were told to stop, recording or whatever. It's like, this is my act of resistance. Right. And I think for some people.
That more so in the George Floyd case.
Yeah. But in this case.
The people, we're talking about officers who have guns and who have authority saying that you can't, you can't be here or you can't film or whatever. In this case, on the plane, on the train.
Yeah, I cannot imagine. And I did wonder about, like, is anybody in there saying, like, get off of him, or, so I am interested to hear.
I didn't hear
it either. I didn't hear it either.
And that's not to say that
it didn't happen.
We just,
that it didn't happen.
We're just not privy to that.
Yeah. And I also, when I saw it, because I saw like still pictures of it, I'm not in a space where I can watch a video of another person dying on, while being recorded. Right. I just, I'm just not there.
Because you can't unsee that.
Right. That's right. That's right. That's right. So, but I do think, though, there is, I like that you kind of brought that in, because when we think about bystanders that see injustice and do nothing about it, not only the person recording, but the other people around. Right.
There were plenty of other people.
Yes, there were. It was a full train. And so so I do wonder about the details there. I do wonder about those bystanders. And I think that's a great example of sort of like the more passive or non-allyship end of the continuum. Right. Absolutely. Right. And so after the bystander, we have the upholder, right? So we've gone from the non-ally, who's like, either oblivious or denying that there is injustice. We go to the bystander, who notices the injustice but does nothing. And then we go to the upholder, and this person observes the injustice, but really doesn't know like what to do. And so that not knowing upholds the status quo. Right. So, so they just like don't know. So I know that this is happening. I know that this group is being marginalized. I know that there is a challenge here. There's injustice here. I just don't know what to do. And that's the upholder.
And perhaps that might have been what was going on that train.
Sure.
There may have been folks who just didn't know what to do. I don't know. I wasn't there. It's just, one of those things. But ultimately, if you find yourself in that space where you are, you see the injustice and you're stuck, what do you advise someone who's like, I don't know how to address this? What would you advise them to do?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. Because I think about, so I've ridden, the New York subways. And first of all, there's a lot going on very often. And sometimes when something is happening and it's sensational, you're almost like, I don't know what to do, or maybe I do nothing, or I think sometimes the shock, sometimes like getting over the shock of whatever is happening, either the violence of what's happening or the sort of like the incredibleness of what's happening. I think sometimes people are not sure. So you're on a train and somebody's in a chokehold. It's like, what do I do here? I think sometimes I would maybe put yourself in the position of the whoever the victim is. Like, what is happening here? So maybe addressing, like, could you loosen up on him? Like he seems like he's really in distress, or something like that. But I think speaking up, I think people have a hard time with it because we are so used to just not doing it,
which is not a good place.
It's not a good place.
When you think about, women have had to endure a lot when it comes to sexual harassment in particular.
Sure.
I think about, times that I've been catcalled or, which basically is, someone has like made a comment. Yeah. A random person has made a comment about you or your body parts, without your permission. You see that we've been in places or spaces where someone may make comments about women in demeaning ways, and if you're an upholder in those situations, meaning you just kind of allow it to continue to happen, then it's going to continue to happen. And at the expense of, women who potentially could be voiceless and powerless in positions where there may be others who hold power, who are the ones that are actually causing the harm, if you will.
And I think I think just sort of like, so, you're in a position where somebody is objectifying or, a woman, put, any woman in your life in that seat. So, your daughter or your mom, what would you do if this was happening to that, that person, that loved one in your life? And I think once we do that, once we become more empathetic, then we're in a space where we want to take action, right? Because now we feel it, rather than just being observers of it.
Yeah, it's easy to distance ourselves.
It is.
Well, it doesn't have anything to do with me.
Right. They're not talking about me. They're not talking about anybody that I know. I don't really know what's going on with that woman, what she did or didn't do, or that kind of thing, right?
It's the whole blame the victim thing that can occur.
Yes, absolutely. But I think, sort of growing more empathetic, I think is really important.
Yeah. So let's go along the continuum some more.
Sure.
So we've got, after the upholder, we've got the conveyor.
We got the conveyor. So this person notices the injustice. They feel really badly about it, and their actions are more passive. So we see something on social media and we like it, and maybe we pass it along. That's the conveyor. They sort of convey the message. So a little bit more active than sort of the other three that we just discussed.
Sure.
A little bit more active than the upholder, more active than the bystander. But that's sort of the limit to, there are very serious limits to what they will actually do, or what they can actually do.
Yeah.
But that's the conveyor.
Yeah, and I would say the conveyor oftentimes may be passive because they might risk, and we've talked about this in previous podcasts, they might risk losing capital.
Yes.
They belong to a group that really is not aligned to the injustices.
Yeah.
That's not even the right way to say it, but
no, but they
Go ahead.
No, but they do. They belong to a group that may not either, the group themselves may be non-allies or bystanders, right? So they may be people who are, perpetrating some of those injustices, either by their speech or their actions or their lack of action. So, or just by their apathy. They're just, they just don't care.
Right.
Yeah.
That's true. And unfortunately, when that happens, if I'm a conveyor, and so you talked with the upstander part of the continuum, you talked about empathy. As a conveyor, I probably have a little more empathy.
Yeah.
Because I see an injustice and it's like, oh, that really isn't right, and, I don't want people to think that I agree with this injustice. And so, I'm going to be bold and I'm going to hit the like, or I'm going to share it on my social media post.
Right.
But you're not going to see too much more from me, and you're not going to hear too much more from me. I'm not going to necessarily speak out against something.
Right.
You're not going to see me marching. You're not going to see any overt actions.
Right.
But at least, people will know that, that I care about these issues.
That's right. I think about, I think it was after the George Floyd murder, but remember the blackout on Instagram, right? And they were like, just put a blank post or whatever, and people did that. And for some people, you kind of never heard about that topic again, and it could be that that's all they felt that they were empowered to do. But that's an example. That's a conveyor kind of activity, right? That's a conveyor kind of activity. So we go from conveyor to the supporter.
Yeah, and so the supporter really kind of is willing to take a little bit more action. They're not just kind of sitting back, allowing the injustices to occur. They are the ones that are going to speak up, but they might speak up if it's happening to somebody that they know. So that is not nice what you said to my friend Erika. Like, she is a woman. You should respect her as a woman. That the supporter cares about the people that they know, and they are not afraid to speak on behalf of their friends or their loved ones about some kind of injustice that may occur. We've also seen where the supporters could also be an organization that writes a letter, or that puts a statement on their website that says, we are an anti-Black not anti-Black,
anti-racist,
anti-racist. Oh gosh,
like, who is it? Who's anti-Black?
Exactly. I'm like, that's terrible. We are an anti-racist organization, or we are an anti, any kind of injustice against any group of, marginalized, any marginalized group of people. The supporter is gonna, but again, that's still a little passive, but it at least, there's a little less fear around letting the world know how I feel about this, because it might hit home,
That's right.
And people, if it hits home, you don't really appreciate what's going on.
That's right.
Like I talked to, and I'm sure you have too, parents of biracial children who have, once having biracial children and seeing, how there may be a difference in how their biracial children may be treated compared to their children who might not be biracial. They become supporters.
Absolutely.
Rather rather fervently, because it hits home.
That's right.
In a way that it may not have hit home before.
Absolutely. This morning I was watching these crazy Instagram videos, and one of the videos is these two little girls, and the younger sister is like, I'm being bullied, and the older sister is like, who is it? Who did it? What's their name? And so then later,
it's not funny, but it's because it's children.
Who did it? And so later, the little girl says, she made me tell her, so I told her. And the girl's like, yep. And I told her, it's just a really great video. It's like, yep. And she's not going to be messing with her anymore. And to me, that's a supporter, right?
Yes,
so
absolutely.
This girl isn't a champion of everybody on the playground. It's just my sister. Right. And I'm going to make sure that she's good. And I think the supporter does that, right? Yes. Who is it? We're not going to take this.
Right.
But the whole issue itself is like, it's terrible.
Right.
But this is just about my sister being hurt. Right.
Right.
And I think
we can't have that.
We can't have that. We can't have that. We can't have that. But I think that is a way, though, like your example about, of a mother of biracial children, very often supporters, that's how it's almost like their introduction. So they go from being a non-ally, like not even realizing this is an issue, to like, now my loved one is being targeted. So we go right to supporter.
Right.
We go right to being a supporter.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point. And we should probably also note that the continuum is not like linear.
Right.
So there may be circumstances where where you're completely a non-ally about something, and then you may jump from being that, like the description you just gave, you may jump from being a non-ally to a supporter in a certain situation. Right. And then we have the champion.
So now we're getting to the more active end of the continuum. And so the champion openly stands in solidarity with oppressed or marginalized people. They identify as champions for justice, but their actions are limited, right? So they may go on a march.
Yes.
They may go on a march, right? They may buy from an organization or support an organization. You talked about the organization that says, we're an anti-racist, organization. So we may support that, or because I'm a champion for that, that cause. But I'm not going, I don't know if I'm going to move the needle here, but everybody knows how I feel about this particular issue.
You're vocal about it.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Recently, I believe it was in France, they were trying to raise the retirement age. And so, ageism is another area. So, oftentimes those who are more senior, so privilege tends to be for those who are under 55, between 20 something and 55. But when you start getting further into your advanced ages, you'll start to see some changes in how society sees you and how they treat you. So in France, they wanted to raise the retirement age. So you would think, that that generation, that older generation, who are essentially the target of this law, may be passive and may decide to because you don't typically see seniors marching. But the allies stepped up. The champions stepped up.
Yes.
And I don't know what the status is right now, but I know that the champions said, we cannot stand for this.
They
this
caused
is
some
not
serious
fair.
unrest.
Right.
Yes.
Right. And so that's what the champion does, And then we've got the influencer.
The influencer.
Yeah. Let's talk about the influencer.
Yes.
Because the influencer has a little power.
That's right. That's right. They're able to use their own privilege.
Yes.
And their social capital. You talked about social capital earlier.
Right,
so they use their privilege and their social capital to make recommendations for change in the system.
Right.
In the system.
Right. So I've got my own personal example of that. So we've talked about being at the state, and so while I was there, I would say that I was an influencer. I wanted to be the next level, but unfortunately, some of the power I did not hold. But I had position of power,
that access.
And so the area that I was fighting for was educational equity, and obviously this is the work that we do all the time. So this is still very important to me. But it was really critical that when there was new new regulations that regulations that needed to be revised or practices, that I was going to be vocal in trying to influence the language, some of the programming or some of the activities or how funds were being allocated. And so I used my privilege as a leader in that organization to speak up and to make recommendations for change. And so that is how the influencer operates.
And so from the influencer, we go to change agent.
Yeah.
So the change agent is able to make the change.
That's correct.
Right? So very often you need the influencer. And not only do you need the influencer, but you need the champions, right? So you need the pressure.
Right.
Then you need the recommendations, and then you need the change, which is the ultimate,
ultimate ally.
The ultimate ally. That person. And, we see them, and some of us are not able to be change agents just because of the access.
Right.
Like, so we may not have the access in a system to make the change, but we can be champions.
We can.
And many of us can be influencers, and still some of us, you need the conveyors and you need the supporters. Like you need that whole continuum. And in some places, like you said earlier, we're able to make change. And some places we're conveying messages, that's important too. But in some areas we're like champions, right? We're champions. So we're marching and we're writing and we're, letting people know like this is where we stand. And those are all important too. And so because of that, if you think about the continuum where we go from the non-ally and the bystander to the influencer and the change agent, what we know is that depending upon where we work, what we do, who's in our circle, what we're passionate about, what we have access to, depending upon all those things, we might be, and our belief system, right? And some of the things that we, we might be anywhere along, because like you said, it's not linear. So we might be at any point for different issues and for different areas. So like we know some champions and some influencers in the area of ableism, and they are supporters, and we also know some change agents in the way of like racial equity, right? Like, so we know that in gender equity, like we know, some people that are along those points, and we might be as well. But I think ultimately the goal is to be an ally, be an ally, right? Use your privilege to support the freedom, really, and and limiting marginalization for people, like using for all groups. I mean, that really is our work. And taking us back to our question, why is this so hard? And I think that's one of the things. I think really understanding allyship is one of the reasons why sometimes we don't really understand it.
Yeah. And so where are you on this continuum?
Yeah.
And that's a parting question that we have for you. Where are you in the continuum? We want to hear from you. So please reach out to us on any of our social media platforms. Let us know what you think. Repost this and share your thoughts. Again, I'm Tonya.
And I'm Erika.
And thank you so much for joining us.
Take care, everyone.